and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-Jung Cho. The US, Korea, and Japan have codified their military cooperation involving high-level talks and joint exercises. Today we discuss ways to strengthen the trilateral security posture amid complex dynamics in the region.
These are unprecedented steps for our trilateral security partnership.
地域における安全保障上の増大する課題に対処するため、同盟の戦力体制を最適化していくことが重要であります。
China and Russia are competing now with for influence in North Korea.
In the studio with me, Dr. Patrick Cronin, Asia Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute. Dr. Cronin previously served as Senior Director of the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. Also joining us, Mr. Scott Snyder, the President and CEO of the Korea Economic Institute of America. Previously, Mr. Snyder was the Director of U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. He also served as the Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Center at the Asia Foundation. Mr. Snyder's latest book is The U.S.-South Korea Alliance, Why It May Fail and Why It Must Not. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Dr. Cronin, the defense chiefs of the U.S., Korea, and Japan signed trilateral security cooperation framework, and key elements including regularizing high-level political consultations, the joint exercises, and improving information sharing. What is the significance of codifying the trilateral security cooperation?
Well, at least two things. I think, first of all, it marks the progress that's been made over the last 3 years toward improving cooperation among these three countries. And it's really, for the United States perspective, it's reforming the architecture of the security throughout the Indo-Pacific region. This was Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin's 11th trip to the Indo-Pacific. And at that meeting with the trilateral ministerial meeting, they were able to now institutionalize, to as much extent possible, this trilateral relationship going forward. So not only does it mark the change and the reforms to the architecture in the region of the last 3.5 years, it tries to institutionalize going forward this kind of trilateral cooperation as a pillar for Indo-Pacific security.
Now, Mr. Snyder, the framework is aimed directly at North Korea, but wouldn't the framework also serve to check on China and Russia as well? The defense chiefs expressed strong opposition on any unilateral attempts to change the status quo in the Indo-Pacific waters. Doesn't this show a common intent to respond to China's assertiveness in the South and East China Sea and the Taiwan Strait?
It does, and in fact the statement indicates that they discussed air and naval activities in the region. And so it's, and also I think that the institutionalization process has strengthened a coordinated approach on statements related to South China Sea activities.
And Dr. Cronin, in which case, now that this framework is against Russia and China as well, wouldn't the new framework complicate South Korea's long-held position to seek balanced approach to China and Russia while seeking close cooperation with Japan and US at the same time?
Well, I see it the opposite way. I think this actually strengthens Seoul's leverage vis-a-vis both Moscow and Beijing. They're going to be taken more seriously now because they're part of a larger alliance and coalition that can actually achieve something not just on the peninsula, but in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, and beyond. So I actually think this strengthens South Korea's hand. As for the balance, yes, there's always a balance, and there's economic ties, and there are diplomatic ties, and those will be the balancing levers from this security cooperation, which is a pillar in the other direction against China and Russia to some extent. Not directly aimed at them, but indirectly they'll see it as aimed at them. But meanwhile, Korea will continue to pursue diplomacy and economic ties with both of those countries.
But China seemed really upset about especially U.S. and Japan strengthening security cooperation. Chinese Foreign Ministry expressed opposition to the closer cooperation between the three countries. And how can South Korea maintain good ties with China at this point?
Well, I think that's exactly the point. I mean, the fact that China's upset shows you that this has leverage. That shows you that China cares about that issue, and that means that now Korea's got their attention. So now they can use that as part of the mix as they negotiate with China directly. I think this actually strengthens South Korea's hand. They're not entering a war against China or Russia. All they're doing is they're cooperating on security cooperation with Japan and with the United States for peace and order and stability.
So when Korea aligns more with its ally, United States, it will be respected more from China and Russia.
In this case, yes. Not always. I mean, there are some cases where that might not be true. But I think in this instance, where there's a general set of security frameworks, I think this does help South Korea.
Mr. Snyder, the U.S.-Japan alliance is also undergoing significant changes, and after the U.S.-Japan 2+2 Security Consultative Committee meeting, the United States announced that it will transform U.S. Forces Japan into a joint force headquarters. Is the purpose of creating a war-fighting command to respond to a range of contingencies in the region, which may also involve Taiwan? And if there is a Korea contingency, will the U.S. and Japan jointly hold operations in this case?
Well, I do think that these adjustments enable the possibility of the U.S. and Japan working together in a war-fighting environment. I mean, really what is happening is that the U.S. is making adjustments that enable greater jointness in terms of planning and operations with Japanese counterparts. These are still parallel commands. They're not joint. They're not combined the way that the U.S.-Korea combined command is. And that's, of course, the most efficient way to prepare for a war fight. But I do think that this is a step forward in terms of enabling the coordination necessary for both sides to work together. I think it's premature to make any kind of projection as related to what this means for a contingency on the Korean Peninsula. I think a lot of it is focused on actual coordination efforts that are going on, especially in Japan's southwest area close to the Taiwan Straits.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Cronin, U.S. and Japan improving the command and control coordination, what does that mean to U.S., Korea, Japan trilateral security cooperation? Now, is the U.S. and Japan, what just Mr. Snyder just mentioned, going to transform their alliance into something that's similar to US-RK Combined Forces Command? And are we in this direction of trilateral alliance?
Well, that's a few steps down the road, perhaps. I think we need to take a step back and recognize that this, first of all, this joint force headquarters is not yet stood up, right? This is the plan. They've announced the plan to stand this up next year. Secondly, as Scott Snyder was saying, this is mostly about U.S.-Japan getting a little more operational, especially as they think about China's threat to the Senkaku Islands and over Taiwan contingencies in the Southwest Island chain. Thirdly, though, yes, it's also about conducting missions and training for missions and being operational between the U.S. and Japan for missions that could affect the Korean Peninsula. For instance, think logistics and maneuver. There are a lot of support missions that may be necessary, and they'll be able to cooperate better. Will this lead to a real operational combined command between U.S. and Japan in the future? We don't know that. That may be forced on them by the contingencies or the situation in the region. If China or North Korea get too aggressive, then it might be urgently needed. And that may also be why the trilateral cooperation advances or doesn't advance. It all depends on how these adversarial or potential adversarial threats emerge. If they start to be sublimated, if diplomacy works, if things back off and back down, maybe these things don't mature so fast. On the other hand, they're there as latent alliance capabilities if they're needed.
Mr. Snyder, China has so far kept its distance from North Korea and Russia's alignment, saying that it is a bilateral issue. But now that U.S., South Korea, and Japan are more closely cooperating together, wouldn't this have China draw closer to North Korea and Russia?
I suppose that it's possible that China could try to mirror image what is happening among the U.S., Japan, and South Korea. But I think that in the current situation, China is really trying to keep its distance from any activities that might generate what they're calling a new Cold War environment. And so I do think that that means that China is keeping its distance to some degree from the North Korea-Russia cooperation. We'll have to see, how things develop. I think that, basically the main point of leverage that China has on this issue is going to come in the context of managing its relationship with Russia.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Cronin, the Trilateral Security Cooperation Framework is in the form of a memorandum of cooperation, which is not legally binding. Do you think there's still a possibility that the trilateral cooperation may be weakened should there be a new government in the three countries? How would U.S. elections impact the ongoing trilateral cooperation?
Well, I think yes is the short answer. It could be affected by new administrations because this is an executive agreement. However, the more time that goes on where these three governments are working trilaterally, the more institutionalized this becomes. This process has a certain life of its own, and that's a good thing here because it's in the interest of all three countries. I do think that just because it's a memorandum of understanding doesn't mean it's not important. We've already seen the progress that's been made by these three countries on tracking North Korean missiles. That's serious intelligence sharing going on between these three countries. And now they've been doing exercises, and this allows them to go one step further in thinking about plans.
And Mr. Snyder, some in Washington argue that during a contingency, the United States should focus on keeping all its capabilities focused on China and let its allies defend for itself. And some even go as far as talking about the possibility of pulling U.S. forces out of Korea, while others say that if China launches a major war, it could incite North Korea to expand the war front onto the Korean peninsula, and that's why U.S. forces Korea should stay fixed on the peninsula. Which perspective is more in line with U.S.'s regional strategy and its interests?
Well, this particular debate that's going on in Washington right now, I think, is a hypothetical debate that we have the luxury of having at this moment. But it does have an effect on how we think about defense planning. And I think the main issue really there is that overall the trend, I think, in international security is to look at security in a universal context. Another way of putting it is that maybe in the 1950s we could imagine that the Korean Peninsula could be separated from the Taiwan Strait, but the likelihood of horizontal impact of a conflict in Taiwan or Korea on the other theater is much higher in today's world. And so I think we have to grapple with that. The other issue that I think we have to keep in mind is we have a mutual defense treaty with South Korea. We don't necessarily have that with Taiwan. So we have to acknowledge that fact. And then finally, I would simply observe that deterrence of China may become an overarching strategic objective that will shape our process in terms of thinking about strategic priorities. But we need to manage it in a deliberate and thorough fashion over time rather than necessarily making any kind of dramatic adjustments.
And Dr. Cronin, as China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran seek closer ties, there's greater likelihood of multiple wars breaking out simultaneously. Isn't the existing U.S. national defense strategy of focusing on great power competition increasingly becoming ineffective? Is the United States ready to fight multiple wars?
Well, there's several questions there. First of all, I don't think we're becoming ineffective. I think we're having a great effect. I think the fact that we've built up such a security architecture with allies and partners over the last 3.5 years is really significant. And I can talk about everything from AUKUS and the Quad to what's going on with the Philippines to what's going on with the trilateral relations among Korea and Japan. And not only is that helping to preserve deterrence in the Pacific, but whether we're dealing with Europe and the Russia-Ukraine war, or whether we're dealing with the ghastly things that are going on right now in the Middle East, the barriers to escalation to major war are much higher than are expected. So we should not jump into, forget about multi-front war, even one big war would be terrible. But seriously, for military planning constructs, we need to be planning for multiple wars. There is going to be a relationship between Taiwan and Korea and between the Middle East and East Asia. All of these things are true. So if war does break out and we have to be prepared for it, we better be planning for it. Are we prepared for that today? No, we're not. We're trying to buy time by maintaining deterrence so that we're in a better position, so that we'll have the munition stockpiles, we'll have the allies and partners capability, we'll have the logistics capabilities ready to go if unfortunately, war breaks out. But the intent, the investment, is to deter war from breaking out in the first place.
But there's a big school of thought in Washington that United States is no longer have that power and ability to fight multiple wars and be the world police anymore.
Sure. Okay. Well, I need to give an hour lecture on what's happening in the world to try to answer that question right. Yes, we're not back in the early post-World War II era, where the United States was the dominant economy and came out of World War II with a massive military. Although that didn't stop the Korean War from breaking out because we started to come home. So it does depend on how ready we are and how postured we are with allies and partners, whether we could deter war from breaking out. And I think right now we are more forward, more deployed, more ready, working with more allies and partners to try to prevent war from breaking out. Now, do we have the resources to fight a war on our own? No, we don't. That's why allies and partners are so critical. And that's what the United States is investing in. And that's why Korea is so important as an ally and partner in what it's doing, including its defense industry, by the way, as it moves up as an arms supplier for basically an arsenal of democracy versus what North Korea is providing to Russia's war effort in Ukraine. I think this is a real opportunity for the United States, yes, to think again as we get through our election process in November. Whoever wins, they're going to want to do a posture review, a force posture review, and think about whether we can make further changes. But I think right now, we are deterring war from breaking out. We are working with allies and partners, and we are finally reinvesting in some of the industrial capacity we need.
Can I just add a comment to that?
Sure.
I'm not sure that in today's world we can really pursue an approach of peace through strength without allies on our side. It's just a reality of the situation that we face today.
Now, Mr. Snyder, the Chinese ambassador to North Korea did not attend the Korean War Armistice Anniversary and Anti-American Rally in Pyongyang. And it is unusual for China to boycott such important events. China also reportedly demanded the repatriation of North Korean workers in China and also removed the Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un footprint plaque installed on a street in Dalian in May. Do you think that Beijing and Pyongyang are becoming estranged? Has the DPRK-Russia relationships have had an impact on that?
Yeah, these are really interesting and, from my perspective, unanticipated developments in the North Korea-China relationship, especially in the 75th anniversary year, marking a normalization of diplomatic relations. And my way of thinking about it is that Kim Jong-un clearly wants diversification from his dependency on China, and Russia may be perceived as a way of achieving that goal. But he may be overestimating his ability to achieve that kind of independence from China. And so we'll have to wait and see how this plays out. On the Chinese side, what I would say is that it doesn't look like the Chinese are being drawn into the kind of Cold War competition that Kim Il-sung tried to create between the Soviet Union and China. And I think that's probably smart on the part of the Chinese not to be drawn into that kind of competition.
You said it's unusual. Then is this a show of unhappiness on China's part?
Well, it's a demonstration of strain. I don't think that we really can say with certainty all of the factors that may be leading to that strain, or even who might be more frustrated within the relationship at this moment. But we definitely see signs of distress. And I also have to note that because it's the 75th anniversary, in a way, I think in the China-North Korea relationship, it may be that the other shoe has not yet dropped. In other words, there could be other developments in the relationship that we see ongoing for which these activities are actually precursors or kind of pre-negotiations for future developments.
Now, Dr. Cronin, do you agree with the view that China is the one who is seriously negatively affected by the DPRK-Russia Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Agreement? Some say that the two countries agreeing to exchange weapons and military technology and coming to each other's defense is aimed at China because South Korea and United States obviously will not attack North Korea.
Well, I don't know that China is losing any sleep over the Russia-North Korea relationship. I don't think they like it. And I think maybe one of the messages from Beijing at not going to the 71st anniversary of the end of the armistice was related to the fact that they're sending a message to Pyongyang. You've got the successor to Stalin. You've got Putin. Make him help you. But that sounds like sentimentality. I mean, I agree, Scott Snyder is saying we don't have enough information to really know what's driving them. I do think Scott's got another point here, which is that China is trying to ride above these conflict zones to project its leadership in the world, especially toward the global south, toward Southeast Asia. And I think that's what they're trying to do, that we're not Russia, we're not North Korea, we are China, and we are the future leader.
Mm-hmm. Now, Mr. Snyder, from China's point of view, it didn't see any reason to play a constructive role as requested by the United States. But now that the North Korea and Russia is more closely aligning together, and that led to more cooperation among United States, South Korea, and Japan, and also NATO's increased presence in the region, isn't this incentive enough to China to join in on the pressure campaign against North Korea?
Well, China's going to act in its own interests, and in the context of the Sino-U.S. rivalry, I'm not expecting China to do any favors for the United States. But I do think that China has a set of points of leverage on this particular issue, and they mostly are related to the future development of the China-Russia relationship. And so that's where I'm going to be watching. How far does China go in terms of continuing to enable support for Russia in its activities in Ukraine, and where does it try to draw a line as related to some of those activities? You know, one of the really interesting things about Putin's visit to Pyongyang is it kind of stepped on China's toes in terms of China's own sphere of influence. And so I think we have to see, you know, how this gamesmanship in the China-Russia relationship actually plays out.
And Dr. Cronin, in a recent congressional hearing, Deputy Secretary Kurt Campbell said that China and Russia are now competing for influence in North Korea, and China is anxious about some of the steps that Russia has taken with North Korea. Can the U.S. use this subtle distrust and friction between China and Russia to keep them apart, just like how Nixon administration succeeded to do?
Well, we need to try, and I think Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell's larger point, was that we need to be diplomatically active around the world, not just on the Korean Peninsula and with China, but also with the global south. And that's deficient in our sort of activity right now. So we worry a lot about deterrence in the military, and that is important. But we also need to worry about what's happening with the finance and economics. We need to worry about the diplomacy. And so, yes, we need to take advantage of this diplomatic opportunity. But as Scott Snyder suggested, China's looking at the competition with the United States. And that's what's going to be the basic determinant of whether they cooperate or not. So I don't know how much room there is to cooperate.
And Mr. Snyder, former senior North Korean officials who were involved in sanctions evasion activities say that China often cracks down on North Korea's illegal activities hard to tame North Korea. And those senior North Korean officials say that Chinese sanctions have more teeth than U.S. sanctions. Now that China has all these information on the weaknesses of North Korea, what constructive role that China can play?
Well, so what that's really pointing to is that China has an incredible amount of leverage on North Korea. The question has always been whether it's willing to use that leverage or whether it sees the use of that leverage as counterproductive to its own objectives. What we really haven't seen yet is China pursue a whole of Korean Peninsula strategy that stands a chance of actually working. You know, in an odd sort of way, China is in a theoretical position of being able to do things on the peninsula that others might not be able to do, and yet they haven't really found a way in terms of their own diplomatic approaches to be able to achieve success in that regard.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Snyder, Dr. Cronin, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.